Your computer works perfectly. It boots in seconds, runs your browser, handles your documents, plays your music, does everything you actually need a computer to do. And then one day, the company that built your operating system tells you it is obsolete. Not because your hardware is broken, not because it can no longer do the job, but because they changed the rules. And now you have a choice. Spend hundreds of dollars on new hardware you do not need. Stick with a system that is no longer receiving security updates and is slowly turning into a target. Or do what a growing number of smart, informed PC users are quietly doing. They are switching to Linux, and they are not looking back. What is happening right now in the world of personal computing is one of the most significant shifts in the history of the desktop operating system. October 14th, 2025 was the day Microsoft officially ended support for Windows 10, an operating system that had served hundreds of millions of users faithfully for a full decade. On that day, Microsoft stopped issuing security patches, bug fixes, and technical support for Windows 10 consumer editions. Every vulnerability discovered after that date goes unpatched. Every exploit written to target Windows 10 will keep working indefinitely, with no defense coming from Microsoft. And the company's response was simple: buy a new PC and upgrade to Windows 11. But for a staggering number of users, that response landed like a slap in the face. The number you need to understand is 240 million. That is how many personal computers worldwide could not upgrade to Windows 11 because they failed to meet Microsoft's hardware requirements. Not because they were slow, not because they were broken, because they lacked a specific security chip called TPM 2.0, which is standard on most computers built after 2016, but absent on hundreds of millions of perfectly functional machines built before then. Canalys reported that 240 million PCs fell into this category at the time Windows 10's end of support was announced. These are real machines sitting on real desks, running real work, serving real people every day, machines that were arbitrarily declared incompatible with the future Microsoft had designed. And the computers that do meet the requirements, Windows 11 is waiting for them with a different kind of problem entirely. Windows 11 came with changes that tens of millions of users did not want and did not ask for. It brought heavier telemetry, the background data collection that sends information about how you use your computer back to Microsoft servers. It brought advertising embedded in the Start menu, where your operating system began showing you promotional content in the same place you look for your programs. It brought persistent pressure to sign in with a Microsoft account rather than a local account, making it harder and harder to use your own computer without being connected to a corporate ecosystem. It brought Microsoft Copilot, an AI assistant baked directly into the operating system that some users welcomed and many others experienced as intrusive. And it brought a heavier resource footprint, a system that consumes more RAM at idle, demands more storage, and runs more background processes than the operating system it replaced. For users on older hardware that technically did qualify for the upgrade, the experience was often worse, not better. Windows 11 on a machine with 8 gigabytes of RAM and a 7th generation processor is not the same experience as Windows 11 on new hardware. Many users who made the upgrade did so and immediately regretted it, and so the migration began. The End of 10 campaign, backed by organizations including Debian, Fedora, GNOME, KDE, and Zorin OS, organized to meet people exactly where they were, connecting users with local volunteer groups and repair cafes that would help them install Linux on their existing hardware in person for free. The campaign was intentionally neutral about which specific Linux distribution was best because it understood that the goal was not ideology, it was practical computing. Keep your hardware alive, keep your data private, keep your money in your pocket. Zorin OS's developers alone reported over 780,000 Windows users transitioning to their Linux distribution in the direct wake of Windows 10's end-of-life announcement. That is not a niche technology experiment. That is a mass migration. By June 2025, Linux crossed the 5% desktop market share threshold in the United States for the first time in history, according to StatCounter data. That milestone sounds modest until you understand the baseline. For most of the past 2 decades, Linux desktop market share globally hovered below 2%. The common wisdom was that Linux was for developers, for servers, for hobbyists who enjoyed spending their weekends configuring terminal commands. That common wisdom has been collapsing in real time. By the end of 2025, Linux had reached 4.7% global desktop market share, a 70% increase from just 3 years earlier. Current growth trajectories suggest Linux could reach 6% of global desktop market share by late 2026, which would represent a sustained doubling of its footprint within 4 years. In a market as large and as entrenched as desktop operating systems, that kind of growth does not happen by accident. It happens because something fundamentally changed. What changed is that Linux got genuinely good for ordinary users, and the alternatives got genuinely worse. Those two things happened simultaneously, and the combination created a moment that people inside the Linux community had been waiting for since the very beginning. Linux Mint, the distribution that most consistently comes up when ordinary former Windows users are asked what they switched to, released version 22.3 in January 2026 with a redesigned application menu, a new system information tool that shows hardware details without requiring the user to open a terminal window, and support guaranteed through April 2029. You install it, and it looks like an operating system. The desktop has a taskbar at the bottom, start menu in the corner, and a file manager that behaves the way file managers should behave. You open a browser, and it is a browser. You plug in a USB drive, and it mounts. You connect to Wi-Fi, and it connects. For the vast majority of everyday computing tasks, the experience is immediately recognizable to anyone who has used a Windows PC for the past 20 years. Ubuntu, the distribution that powers the largest share of Linux web servers globally, and commands nearly 28% adoption. Among professional developers, according to the 2025 Stack Overflow Developer Survey, offers a slightly different visual experience but the same fundamental accessibility. Pop! OS, developed by the PC manufacturer SystemSick, was designed specifically with the transition user in mind. Fedora offers bleeding-edge software in a polished package. And for users with older, lower-powered hardware who need the lightest possible footprint, distributions like Lubuntu and Linux Lite can turn a decade-old laptop with 2 gigabytes of RAM into a responsive, usable daily computer in a way that no version of Windows has been capable of for years. This last point is the one that the word downgrading in so many of these conversations actually refers to, and it is worth unpacking carefully. When people call the switch to Linux a downgrade, they mean it as a kind of joke aimed at Microsoft's framing of the situation. Microsoft presented Windows 11 as the upgrade, the modern platform, the secure and capable future. Linux, in that framing, is the alternative you choose when you cannot afford or refuse to access the official upgrade path. But the experience that hundreds of thousands of users have reported after making the switch inverts that framing completely. On the hardware that Microsoft declared obsolete, Linux does not feel like a downgrade. It feels like a rescue. A laptop that was sluggish and bloated on Windows 10 after years of accumulated telemetry processes, background services, and automatic updates often runs faster on Linux than it did when it was brand new. The reason is straightforward. Linux does not carry the weight that Windows carries. A modern Linux distribution with a lightweight desktop environment can run comfortably on 2 gigabytes of RAM and a processor that was manufactured in 2012. Windows 11, in practice, wants 8 gigabytes of RAM for a smooth experience, and a processor from 2018 or newer for its full feature set. The privacy dimension of this migration cannot be separated from the practical hardware story, because for many users, the two motivations are deeply connected. Windows telemetry has been a source of friction since Windows 10 introduced mandatory data collection in 2015, and with each subsequent version, the scope and intrusiveness of that collection has increased rather than decreased. Windows 11 cannot have telemetry disabled on its consumer editions. The setting exists, but it does not do what users assume it does. It reduces the volume of data collected, not the collection itself. Advertising appears in the Start menu and in the Microsoft Edge browser that opens by default whenever Windows wants to show you something. The push to sign in with a Microsoft account rather than a local account is persistent and becomes more aggressive with each system update. Many users who made the upgrade to Windows 11 described the experience not as using software they owned, but as being managed by software that had been installed on hardware they happened to have paid for. That distinction between owning your tools and renting your experience is one that resonates deeply with people once it has been framed. Linux does not collect telemetry by default. It does not show you advertisements anywhere in the interface. It does not ask you to sign in to a corporate account to use basic features. It does not quietly install updates that change how your system looks or behaves without your explicit permission. It does not contact a server to verify that your software license is still valid. The software you install on Linux is yours. The configuration you create is yours. The data on your machine stays on your machine. For users who have spent years feeling vaguely uneasy about what their operating system was doing in the background, the experience of running Linux for the first time often produces something close to relief. Gaming on Linux deserves its own discussion, because the gaming situation was historically the single most powerful argument against switching, and that argument has been substantially undermined over the past few years. Valve, the company behind Steam, began investing heavily in Linux gaming compatibility through a project called Proton, a compatibility layer that translates Windows game code into something Linux can run natively. The results have been remarkable. As of late 2025, a significant majority of the games on Steam are verified or reported to run on Linux through Proton, including many major titles that were originally Windows exclusive releases. The Steam Deck, Valve's handheld gaming console that runs Steam OS, a Linux-based operating system built on Arch Linux, introduced an entirely new population of users to the experience of running Linux without ever being told they were running Linux. By December 2025, Linux reached an all-time high of 3.2% market share among Steam users. That number represents millions of PC gamers who have chosen to play on Linux, and it represents a community that is growing month by month as more games become compatible and more users realize the transition is manageable. There is still an honest conversation to be had about what Linux does not do well, because a video about why people are choosing Linux that does not acknowledge its limitations is not a video anyone should trust. Software compatibility remains the most significant barrier for many users. Adobe Creative Suite, Photoshop, Premiere, Illustrator, After Effects does not run natively on Linux. If your professional or creative workflow depends on Adobe software, the path forward is complicated. You can run some Adobe applications and compatibility layers, but the experience is not seamless, and for professional use, it often falls short. Microsoft Office in its full native desktop form is not available on Linux, though Microsoft 365's web applications work in any browser, in LibreOffice. The free open source alternative handles the majority of Office document tasks with reasonable fidelity. Certain specialized professional applications in fields like engineering, architecture, finance, and media production have Linux versions or workable alternatives, but others simply do not. For users in those categories, Linux is not a replacement for Windows, and anyone who tells you otherwise is not being honest with you. Hardware compatibility has improved enormously, but is not yet universal. Most common peripherals, monitors, keyboards, mice, standard printers, work without any configuration, but certain specialized devices, particularly some wireless printers from manufacturers who do not support Linux, certain multifunction scanners, and some newer audio interfaces, require workarounds or do not work at all out of the box. Wi-Fi adapter support, while dramatically better than it was 5 years ago, still has gaps with certain chipsets, particularly in low-cost laptops that use budget wireless components. These are real problems that real users encounter, and the Linux community's answer, which is usually some version of "there is a solution, you just have to find it," is not always satisfying to someone who just wanted their computer to work without research. But here's the context that makes those limitations meaningful rather than disqualifying. The users who are switching to Linux in 2025 and 2026 are largely not users whose workflows depend on Adobe software or specialized professional tools. They are the vast majority of computer users whose actual daily computing consists of web browsing, document editing, video streaming, email, and video calls. For those users, Linux is not a compromise. It is a fully functional computing environment that runs faster on their existing hardware than the operating system they are replacing, costs nothing, never shows them advertisements, never asks them to link their identity to a corporate cloud service, and receives regular security updates from communities of developers who have no financial incentive to make those updates serve anyone but the users. The German state of Schleswig-Holstein became the first European region to completely replace Microsoft tools with Linux and LibreOffice in public offices as of April 2024, a government migration covering tens of thousands of workstations that demonstrated at real scale what the shift looks like in practice. Several other European Union governments are actively evaluating similar migrations, driven by concerns about digital sovereignty and dependence on American technology companies. The European Union has been exploring the concept of an EU Linux operating system for public administrations across member states. These are not fringe experiments. They are institutional decisions by governments that have decided that the cost of Microsoft licensing, combined with the privacy and sovereignty implications of running American commercial software on government hardware, no longer makes sense when a capable, free, auditable alternative exists. There is another dimension to this story that rarely makes headlines, but matters enormously to the people living through it: electronic waste. When Microsoft declared 240 million PCs incompatible with Windows 11, it effectively issued a disposal notice for 240 million machines. Industry analysts estimated that a significant portion of those devices would end up in landfills or recycling facilities rather than being repurposed. The environmental cost of manufacturing new computers is substantial. The production of a single laptop generates roughly 300 to 400 kilograms of carbon dioxide, equivalent across its full supply chain, from raw material extraction through fabrication and shipping. Throwing away functional hardware to satisfy software requirements is not just expensive for the individual user, it is environmentally destructive at a scale that is difficult to comprehend when you multiply one discarded laptop by 240 million. Linux changes that equation entirely. A computer that cannot run Windows 11 can run Linux Mint or Ubuntu without hesitation. The machine gets a new life. The user saves money. The planet avoids one more unnecessarily discarded device. The Linux community has built this environmental argument explicitly into its advocacy, and it resonates with users who are increasingly conscious of the lifecycle costs of consumer technology. The financial argument is one that deserves to be stated plainly and without softening. A new Windows 11 PC capable of running the operating system well, with 16 gigabytes of RAM, a modern processor, and adequate storage, costs somewhere between $500 and $1,500 depending on the configuration and manufacturer. A Windows 11 Pro license purchased separately costs around $200. Microsoft's extended security update program for Windows 10 consumers offered one additional year of critical security patches through October 2026, but no further extension exists after that for home users. The commercial ESU rate for businesses is $61 per device per year. Linux is free, not free as in subsidized by advertising revenue, or free as in the hardware vendor paid for a license on your behalf. Free as in you download it, install it, use it, update it, and never pay a licensing fee to anyone. The software that comes with a standard Linux installation, LibreOffice for documents and spreadsheets, Firefox or Chromium for browsing, VLC for media, GIMP for photo editing, Thunderbird for email, is also free, open source, and actively maintained. For a family with 3 computers that cannot run Windows 11, the choice between buying 3 new machines and installing Linux on their existing hardware represents a difference of potentially thousands of dollars. That is a real number with real consequences for real households. The question that brings all of this together is the one that the ordinary person sitting in front of a perfectly functional laptop is asking right now. My computer still works. Windows 10 is ending its extended security updates in October 2026. The last bridge Microsoft offered is closing. Windows 11 does not feel right, and my hardware may not meet the requirements, or the experience may not be worth the disruption. What do I actually do? The answer that an increasing number of smart, practical, non-ideological computer users are arriving at is to download a Linux distribution, create a bootable USB drive, run it in live mode to test that their hardware works, and if it does, install it alongside or instead of Windows. The process takes an afternoon. The learning curve for everyday tasks takes a week, and what many of them are reporting on the other side of that week is something unexpected. They are not reporting that they miss Windows. They're reporting that they did not realize how much of their frustration with computing over the past decade was coming from the operating system, until the day they stopped using it. Linux is not perfect. It is not for everyone. It does not solve every problem that every user has, but for the hundreds of millions of people who were told their perfectly functional hardware was obsolete, who were shown advertisements in the interface of an operating system they paid for, who watched their computer grow slower and more intrusive with each update cycle, and who were never given a genuine choice about what their machine would do. Linux is not a downgrade. It is the first upgrade those users have had in years,